I had scanned a battlefield once. 3 years old in Terran Reckoning, barely old enough to hold a field kit steady, and my mentor had let me run the analysis on a crater, still warm from a plasma exchange. I remember the readouts: scorched regolith, vaporized alloy, the chemical signature of fear sweat baked into stone. Nothing in that crater frightened me the way a small human girl frightened me on a Tuesday afternoon, on a street called Ares Promenade, under the amber dome light of the human capital on Mars. She was holding a weapon in a paper cup. That is not a metaphor. My wrist scanner, standard issue exchange student grade, calibrated to flag anything above a Tier 2 biological hazard, screamed at me the moment she lifted the cup to her mouth. Compound cluster detected. Sucrose, lactose, tryptophan derivatives, theobromine. Cross-reference controlled substance on 11 of the 14 worlds represented in my dormitory. On my own homeworld, theobromine alone carried a mandatory containment protocol. The girl licked it happily and asked her mother for another scoop. Nobody around her reacted. That was the part my mind could not process. A child, perhaps 6 Terran years old, freely dosed with a neuroactive compound cocktail in a public plaza, and the nearest adult, her mother, holding her other hand, was laughing at something unrelated, entirely unconcerned. I stood very still for 11 seconds. Then I did what any properly trained xenobiology exchange student would do. I followed them. Mars, by the time I arrived, had stopped being a colony and become something else entirely. The practical capital of an entire species. Earth was still there, still populated, still governed, but Earth was crowded, worn thin by its own history. Mars was new. Mars was where humanity built its second draft, and it built it enormous. 7 domes ringed the equatorial basin, each one wider than any city I had walked through at home, each one holding its own weather. Under the Meridian Dome, snow fell on schedule every 3rd evening because the residents had voted for it in a civic poll. An act so casually democratic and so strange to me that I had recorded the vote count in 3 separate journal entries. Under the Christ Dome, the air smelled permanently of rain on hot stone, an atmosphere the settlers had voted for using words like, "reminds us of monsoon season back home," a phrase that meant nothing to me and everything to them. I lived under the Elysium Dome, in a residence hall built for off-world exchange students, one of 200 non-human academics on a planet of 900 million humans. My program was simple in its stated purpose: observe, document, understand. The galaxy had spent 4 decades quietly terrified of Earth's biology, ever since the first trade delegations returned home with medical reports that read like horror fiction. Coffee, chocolate, chili, garlic. An entire cuisine constructed apparently from compounds every other species classified as active toxins. The scholarship existed because the council wanted someone embedded, someone watching, someone who could explain calmly, scientifically, without hysteria, exactly how a species survived a diet like that. I had been chosen because my written applications used the word fascinating 11 times, and because, unlike most of my cohort, I did not flinch when the admissions committee played me a recording of a human eating something called a ghost pepper on a dare. I flinched now, standing in a doorway, watching a child eat what I still, privately, thought of as a neurotoxin delivery system shaped like a waffle cone. The shop was called Lou's, and it had occupied the same corner of Ares Promenade for 11 years, according to the faded plaque beside the door. A human male, Lou presumably, or his descendant, humans were unclear about which, worked behind a long, refrigerated case filled with pale, dense, colorfully labeled substances. Vanilla, strawberry. Something called Rocky Road that contained, according to the ingredient placard, 3 separate compounds my scanner had already flagged as hazardous. I entered slowly. The bell above the door rang, a small, bright sound, and every human inside glanced up and then went back to what they were doing, because an alien in a lab coat standing awkwardly in a doorway was apparently not interesting enough to interrupt a Tuesday. "Help you?" Lou asked. He had flour or sugar dusted faintly on his forearms, and he smiled in a way that reached the corners of his eyes, an expression I had learned, after 2 years on Mars, to trust more than most. I am conducting an observational study, I said. Xenobiology, comparative cuisine. I would like to understand this substance. Ice cream, he said, and gestured at the case like a curator presenting a gallery. You want a scoop or you want the science? Both, if that is permitted. He laughed. Not at me, I had learned to tell the difference by then, and scooped a small amount of something pale yellow into a paper cup, identical to the one the child had carried. He set it on the counter between us like an offering. Vanilla bean, he said. Gateway flavor. Everybody starts here. I did not touch it. I photographed it instead, from 4 angles, and requested a sample vial to run through the residence hall's analysis unit, which Lou provided without hesitation, along with a second scoop. For the walk home, he said, as though I had asked for it. I had not asked for it. I carried it back to the dormitory anyway, held at arm's length, already melting, already a small ongoing crime scene by the standards of at least 6 other planets. The analysis unit took 4 hours and produced 11 pages of results, most of which confirmed what my wrist scanner had already screamed at me on the promenade. Sucrose in concentrations that would trigger metabolic alarms on my homeworld within minutes. Lactose, a compound entirely absent from my own biology, present in quantities sufficient to cause severe gastrointestinal distress in at least 60% of known galactic species. Theobromine, present in a chocolate variant Lou had also given me, unprompted, on the house. A stimulant compound restricted to licensed medical use on 4 council worlds, sold here to children for the equivalent of $3 human. I sat with the report glowing on my desk for a long time. Beside it, forgotten, the first scoop of vanilla had melted entirely into a pale puddle in its cup. I did what any exchange student would do with data this alarming. I filed a preliminary hazard report to my supervising faculty, flagged for urgent review, and requested clearance to conduct a formal cultural biological survey before the Council's next trade summit. My supervisor, a Vesarani biologist named Dral Sanath, who had spent 19 years studying humans and had, by his own admission, stopped being surprised by anything roughly a decade in, approved the request within the hour. His only note appended to the approval read, "Before you write your conclusions, eat something." I did not understand the instruction. I understood it less than a week later, and by then it was too late to ununderstand it. News of my hazard report traveled through the exchange program faster than I expected, which meant that by the following morning, a Doraxi engineering student named Vesk Oruthi was waiting for me outside the lecture hall, arms folded across his carapace in a posture I recognized as challenge. Vesk had been on Mars for 3 years, longer than any of us, and he had built a reputation on a simple principle. Humans were, in his words, a species performing normalcy over a foundation of chaos. And every strange custom I found charming, he found evidence for the theory. He did not dislike humans. He simply refused to be surprised by them twice. "You tasted it," he said. Not a question. Word traveled fast in a residence hall with 200 people, and very little to talk about besides each other. "A trace amount," I said. "For the report." "For the report," he repeated, in a tone that suggested he did not believe me and did not intend to pretend otherwise. "You know what the compound does to a Doraxi nervous system in that concentration?" I did know. I had run the cross-species toxicology myself 3 days earlier, out of professional thoroughness. For his physiology, a single scoop would trigger a cardiac event severe enough to require emergency stasis. "I am aware," I said. "Then you understand why I find your report irresponsible. You are one data point, from one biology, generalizing comfort onto a compound that would kill me in this room, in front of witnesses, in under 4 minutes." He was not wrong. That was the difficult part. Vesk was rarely wrong about the numbers, only about what the numbers meant. "I am not recommending that you eat it," I said. "I am recommending that the Council stop assuming a hazard is universal simply because it is real. The compound is dangerous to you. It is dangerous to me in sufficient quantity. It is apparently something closer to a language for them, a way of saying things they do not have other words for. A language. Vesk's mandibles clicked. A sound I had learned meant something between a laugh and a scoff. You have been here 2 years and you are already writing poetry about their toxins. I am reporting what I observed, I said. A child handed a cup to a stranger from another star system without a moment of hesitation. Tell me another species in this council that offers its hazards to strangers as an act of trust, rather than hoarding them as leverage.
As you can see,
he did not have an answer for that immediately, which was, for Vesk, its own kind of concession. He left without agreeing with me, but he left without the argument he had arrived to have. 3 days later, I noticed his own dietary log. Carefully, privately maintained, the way an engineer catalogs anything he does not yet trust, included a new entry. Vanilla, trace exposure, controlled setting, no adverse reaction. He had gone to lose himself. He had not told me. I did not mention that I knew. I began where any careful researcher begins. At the source. Not the shop, not the ingredient placards, but the humans themselves, in the places they gathered to consume this substance voluntarily, repeatedly, across every age group I could locate. I found them everywhere. At a children's celebration under a striped awning in the Christ Dome, where a crowd of small humans sang a unified, off-key song to one of their own, and then watched, delighted, as an adult set fire to a cake, actual open flame, on a dessert, indoors, before extinguishing it and distributing pieces to the very children who had just watched fire touch their food without a flicker of alarm. Ice cream arrived beside the cake in a matching bowl, melting fast under the dome's warm afternoon light. And the birthday child ate both together with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy that my scanner had no metric for. At a hospital, an actual medical facility, the last place I expected to find the substance, where I watched a nurse hand a small cup of chocolate ice cream to a child recovering from a procedure, and the child's parent thanked the nurse with something that sounded, in the universal translator's approximation, dangerously close to relief. At a funeral. I want to be precise about this because it is the detail that unsettled me most. A human family gathered under gray dome light after burying an elder, stood afterward in a modest kitchen eating ice cream directly from a shared container, passing one spoon between 4 grieving adults, laughing quietly at some memory none of them explained to me. I asked carefully why grief and this substance occupied the same room. An older woman looked at me with patient eyes and said only, "Some things you can't fix, so you make them a little softer instead." I recorded the sentence. I did not understand it for a long time afterward. Mira's family invited me to dinner on a Sunday, an invitation delivered by Mira herself, unprompted, in the form of a hand-drawn note pushed under the residence hall's front desk, with my name spelled almost correctly across the top. Their home sat near the edge of the Cresa Dome, close enough to the reinforced wall that the manufactured rain sometimes misted the windows on schedule at 6 in the evening. Mira's mother, whose name was Renata, cooked something involving tomatoes and garlic that filled the small kitchen with a smell my scanner flagged as containing 4 separate compounds classified as irritants on at least 2 council worlds. Nobody in the house seemed troubled by this. Mira's older brother set the table without being asked twice. Their father, a broad, quiet man named Diego, spent most of dinner asking me careful, genuine questions about my homeworld, listening to my answers the way Lou had listened, like the answer mattered more than the asking. Dessert arrived after the meal had been cleared, and it was, predictably, ice cream. A shared container this time, not individual cups, passed hand to hand around a table of 5, the same spoon used by 4 different mouths in a rotation nobody seemed to track or mind. I declined politely and nobody pressed me. Mira only shrugged and said, "More for us," which struck me as the least offended response to refusal I had encountered from any species in my 3 years of exchange study. What stayed with me longest was not the meal. It was the quiet that settled over the table afterward. Not an absence of conversation, but a kind of contentment I had no equivalent word for in my own language, A stillness that 4 humans and 1 very alert alien guest shared without needing to name it. Diego rested a hand briefly on his daughter's head. Renata hummed something wordless while she cleared the last of the bowls. Mira, sated and unbothered, asked me if I wanted to see her collection of rocks from a place called the Christ Quarry, and I said yes because by that point in the evening, saying yes to Mira had become the only response that made any sense. I wrote to my family that night, a longer letter than I had sent in months, describing the dinner in careful detail because I wanted them to understand what I had begun to understand myself. My mother's reply arrived 2 days later, brief and unmistakably worried, asking whether the exchange program had adequate medical safeguards, whether I had reported the exposure to my supervisor, whether I was certain, her word, underlined twice by the translator's formatting, yes, that I was still thinking clearly. I did not know how to answer that last question honestly, not yet, so I did not answer it at all. I only told her I was well, and that I'd eaten dinner with a family who shared 1 spoon between 4 people and called it ordinary, and that I would explain the rest when I understood it well enough to translate. I am not certain I understand it fully even now, but I no longer think that not understanding is a reason to look away. The child from the promenade found me again the following week, before I had finished processing any of it. Her name, I would learn, was Mira, and she attended a small school 3 blocks from Lou's, and she had apparently informed her entire class that there was an alien who watches people eat ice cream and writes on a tablet, which resulted in 7 children surrounding me outside the shop on a bright Christdome afternoon, each one holding a cup, each one asking, with no trace of my own species' caution, whether I wanted to try theirs. "You keep looking at it like it's going to bite you," Mira said. She had chocolate along one corner of her mouth, and an expression of frank curiosity that I associated by then, almost exclusively with human children under the age of 10. "My scanner indicates it is biologically active," I said. "Everything's biologically active," she said, with the effortless confidence of someone repeating a phrase she had heard an adult use and did not fully understand, but deployed correctly regardless. "That's why it's food." I had no response prepared for that. I have, in the time since, found none better. She held her cup up toward me, strawberry pink, already softening in the warm air, and waited. Not challenging me. Not performing for the other children, though they watched with obvious interest. Simply waiting, the way one waits for a friend to catch up on a walk. I looked at the cup for 4 seconds. I looked at Mira, who was still smiling, entirely unbothered by the pause, entirely unaware that she was asking me to override 2 years of training and a lifetime of instinct that classified sugar, lactose, and cold, combined in that specific ratio as something my body had never once been designed to process safely. I took the smallest possible amount, on the very tip of the small wooden implement she offered, and I touched it to receptors I had never once used for anything but analysis. I will not attempt to translate the sensation into human vocabulary because I do not believe an accurate translation exists. It was cold in a way that startled every thermal receptor I possessed. It was sweet past any threshold my biology associated with nutrition, and directly into a threshold my biology associated with warning. And underneath both of those alarms, for exactly as long as it lasted on my tongue, was something my scanner would never have a category for. Something closer to the sentence the grieving woman had given me weeks before. Softer. Mira watched my face carefully. "Good, right?" "I do not have a category for that answer," I said honestly. She grinned like I had told the funniest joke she'd heard all week, and went back to her own cup, already forgetting the momentous biological event that had just occurred in front of her, because to her it had not been momentous at all. It had been Tuesday. 3 weeks after the dinner, the Christdome's outer seal registered a microfracture during a dust storm, strong enough to darken the sky above the reinforced glass to a deep, bruised orange. I was in the district when the alarm sounded, a low, rolling tone I had been trained to recognize during orientation, but had never once heard triggered in earnest. Emergency lighting bathed the promenade in red. Humans moved with brisk, practiced urgency toward shelter points, none of them screaming, all of them faster than I expected a species without exoskeletal reinforcement to move. I found myself, through no clear decision of my own, running toward Mira's street instead of away from it. The fracture sealed within 11 minutes. Automated systems, backup pressure, the kind of engineering redundancy Vesk would have approved of if he had been there to see it. But 11 minutes is a long time for a 6-year-old to sit in a darkened hallway listening to a structure groan around her. And by the time I reached their door, Diego had already gathered the family into the interior stairwell, the safest point in the house, and Mira was crying in the particular silent, exhausted way of a child who has been brave for longer than she has the resources to sustain. I did not know what use I could be. I had no engineering training, no medical certification, nothing but a scanner that was, in that moment, entirely useless. Renata let me in anyway because the alternative was leaving a guest alone on a darkened street during a structural alarm and even in crisis that appeared to violate something fundamental in how this family operated. We sat together in the stairwell while the storm groaned against the dome above us. Diego produced from a small emergency kit near the door a thermal case, and inside it, absurdly, impossibly, 3 cups of ice cream, already softening in the warm, confined air. "Emergency protocol," he said, with the particular dry humor humans deployed most often when they were frightened, and refusing to let the fear win. "Every house on this street keeps one. Don't ask me whose idea it was originally." Mira took her cup with both hands, still trembling slightly, and ate it slowly, deliberately, the way one performs a familiar ritual specifically because it is familiar. I watched the shaking in her shoulders ease with each spoonful, not because the compound itself calmed anything measurable in her nervous system. I checked later out of habit, and found no meaningful physiological effect beyond the sugar itself, but because the ritual surrounding it did. The routine, the predictability of cold and sweet, and her father's hand resting on her hair, present in a moment when very little else in her small world felt certain. I understood sitting on those stairs in the red emergency light, something I had not understood standing in a doorway on Ares Promenade weeks earlier. The compound was never the point. It had never been the point. It was a vessel humans had built, deliberately or through some long accumulated instinct, to carry comfort into moments where comfort had nowhere else to go. Into grief, into celebration, into a 6-year-old's fear during a structural alarm 3 domes from anywhere I called home. When the all-clear tone finally sounded, Mira looked up at me with chocolate at the corner of her mouth, and eyes still red from crying, and she offered me her spoon, unprompted, the same unhesitating gesture she had offered a stranger on a promenade, weeks before storms and summits had entered either of our lives. I took it this time without needing 4 seconds to decide. There was a night some weeks later when the Elysium Dome ran its scheduled festival, a human custom the settlers called simply the Lights, held every 90 days to mark nothing in particular, which was, I had come to understand, precisely the point. The dome's artificial sky dimmed early, and strings of small, warm bulbs came alive along every rooftop and railing, and the entire population of the sector seemed to spill outdoors at once, unhurried, unafraid of their own crowded numbers in a way that still struck me as faintly reckless. Vendors lined the promenade selling food I had, by then, learned to identify without consulting my scanner. Roasted nuts, something called funnel cake, fried in oil hot enough to blister flesh, dusted with a fine white powder that read, on any instrument, as pure concentrated hazard. And ice cream, of course. 3 separate carts, each with a line long enough that children grew impatient and adults let them, indulgently, the way one indulges a small, familiar weakness. I stood near the edge of the crowd with Vesk, who had come, he insisted, purely for engineering reasons. He wanted to examine how the dome's lighting rig distributed load across 90 days of continuous use, a claim I found less convincing once I noticed he had already purchased, and finished, a cup of something called butter pecan. Around us, the festival did not resemble a hazard site. It resembled the opposite of one. An elderly couple sat together on a low wall near the fountain, sharing a single cup between them with the unhurried patience of people who had shared thousands of cups before this one, and expected to share thousands more, their hands finding each other's between bites without either of them seeming to notice they had done it. A group of teenagers celebrated something. A match won, a name shouted, I never learned the details, by pooling their money for the largest size the nearest cart sold, passing it in a circle, laughing at whoever's turn came with the last half-melted spoonful. A father lifted a small child onto his shoulders so she could see over the crowd, and she held her cone above her head like a small triumphant flag, and nobody around them so much as glanced up in alarm.
Freshly baked
I turned to Vesk.
bread.
You said humans perform normalcy over chaos.
Thank you. It smells delicious.
I did say that. He did not sound as certain of it as he had 3 months earlier. Look at them, I said. This is either the most convincing performance in galactic history, or it is not a performance at all. He watched the crowd for a long moment, mandibles still, his empty cup forgotten in one hand. I do not know which unsettles me more, he said finally. I did not have an answer for him. I only knew that for the first time since arriving on Mars, I stood inside a crowd of 900 million potential hazards and felt, for reasons my instruments could not measure, entirely at ease. I filed my final report 6 weeks later, on the eve of the Council Trade Summit, in a session hall built beneath the tallest spire on Mars, glass walls holding back an atmosphere still thin enough to kill every human in the room within minutes if it failed. My supervisor sat in the observers gallery. Delegates from 11 worlds waited for a hazard assessment they expected to confirm what 4 decades of trade anxiety had already assumed: that human cuisine represented an uncontrolled biological risk requiring formal restriction before further contact expanded. A Threxian trade envoy spoke first before I had even reached the podium, reading from a briefing packet clearly assembled well in advance of my findings. We have received preliminary indications, she said, that this survey may recommend against restriction. I would remind the chamber that 4 council members have already logged medical incidents from unregulated exposure to human food exports. Sentiment is not a substitute for containment protocol. A murmur of agreement passed through several benches. Dral Senoth in the observers gallery did not move, but I felt his attention on me like a weight. Vesk stood from his own seat among the student observers, which surprised me. Student delegates were not typically permitted to address the full council, and I watched 3 procedural officers hesitate before one of them, apparently deciding the novelty outweighed the breach, allowed it. I have spent 3 years cataloging reasons to distrust this species, he said, mandibles clicking once sharply, the way they did when he had decided something against his own preference. I am an engineer. I do not enjoy being wrong about load calculations, and I do not enjoy being wrong about people. I was wrong. I do not know what to recommend the council do with that information, only that it exists, and that dismissing it because it is inconvenient will not make it less true. He sat down without elaborating further. It was, for Vesk, an extraordinary speech, and I understood watching him that it had cost him something to give it. The Threxian envoy did not concede the point, but she did not press it further either. The chamber's attention returned to the podium, and to me. I had prepared a different report than the one I filed 6 weeks earlier. I told them about the compounds because the compounds were real, and I owed the council honesty above all else. Sucrose, lactose, theobromine, all present, all technically hazardous by every existing galactic standard. I did not soften that part, but I told them too about the birthday cake set deliberately alight before children who watched without fear, about the hospital cup handed to a recovering child like medicine that tasted like mercy, about 4 grieving adults sharing 1 spoon in a quiet kitchen because some things cannot be fixed, only made a little softer, about a 6-year-old girl who told me, with more clarity than any textbook I had studied, that everything biologically active is exactly why it counts as food, and who handed a stranger from another star system her own dessert without a single moment of hesitation, because to her, sharing it was simply what you did. This species,
These
I told the assembled
structures
council,
illustrate
did
a
not survive their hazardous
fundamental
biology by
principle
avoiding
of
it. They survived it by
xenobiology.
building an entire
A
architecture of
substance
comfort
like
around it,
sucrose,
one they hand
harmless
without
to
fear
one
to their smallest and their
species,
weakest and their most grieving, the very members of any population you would expect a species to protect most cautiously from harm. I paused because Dral Senoth had told me once that the best data means nothing if you cannot say what it costs to gather it. I do not recommend restriction, I said. I recommend humility. We have spent 4 decades treating their kitchens as weapons depots. I would ask the council to consider instead that we may simply have never been offered a spoon.
Therefore,
The hall was quiet for
I
a long
implore
moment.
the council
Somewhere behind the
to
glass
meet
wall, beyond the
these
thin, poisoned Martian
unfamiliar
air,
cultures,
the amber dome light was
not
fading into
with
evening,
fear,
and under it, I knew without
but
needing to
with
check,
humility.
a shop called Lou's was still open, still scooping something pale and dangerous and warm into paper cups for anyone who asked. I have gone back every week since. I have not stopped flagging the compounds. The report is precise, and precision is a kind of respect. But I no longer stand in the doorway measuring the distance between myself and the counter. Vesk came with me the week after the summit, uninvited, claiming again that he wished only to examine the shop's refrigeration architecture. He ordered butter pecan without consulting the ingredient placard, which I noted silently as the largest concession he had made to any species in the 3 years I had known him. Lou, who had by then heard some garbled second-hand version of our testimony from a regular customer with a cousin in
2
trade
butter
administration,
pecan
refused to
coming
let
up.
either of us pay.
Indeed. The
Diplomats eat
superior
free, he said,
flavor.
waving off my offered
I
credits.
look forward to trying
Somebody told me
it.
you two saved my shop from a council embargo. That is an overstatement of our
Enjoy.
role, I
It's a
said.
gift.
Sounds like exactly what a diplomat would say. He slid 2 more cups across the counter anyway, and I did not argue further because
Thank
I had
you,
learned by
that is
then
very
that some
kind of
gestures are
you.
not meant to be logically resolved. They are only meant to be accepted. I wrote to my mother again the night the summit concluded, a longer letter than the first, and told her everything. The fracture in the dome, the stairwell, the spoon Mira had offered me twice now without hesitation. Either time, the Threxian envoy's objection, Vesk's unlikely testimony, the quiet that had settled over Mira's family table like something with weight and shape. I did not soften any of it, and I did not this time wait for her question about my judgment before answering it. Her reply arrived 3 days later. It was shorter than either of my letters, but it did not ask whether I was still thinking clearly. It asked instead whether the recipe for something called butter pecan could be safely adapted for our own biology, because she had, in her own words, grown curious about what a person is willing to hand a frightened child in the dark. I do not yet know how to answer that question either. I suspect I will spend a long time trying. Some things you cannot fix. You can only let someone hand you a small wooden spoon and trust that they know something about softness that your scanners were never built to hold.